Jam-packed agenda, so I think we're going to get started, if that's all right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. Welcome to CPIC meeting number 7. Hope you've had a chance to at least peek or scan the packet of materials. We do have kind of discussion time sort of built in to all of our discussion items, so but we'll kind of go through that as we move along through the agenda. I'm going to start with just kind of kicking off just as a reminder of our overall project schedule and where we are, and then we're going to jump into some of the survey information with Mary. So I'm going to share my screen. And okay. And hopefully everyone is looking at a PowerPoint presentation or a PDF anyway. Let's do a full screen mode. Okay. So again, here's our overall project schedule. We're sort of in the draft amendments phase of the project. We are still on track to have adoption this summer of our code amendments. What we've been doing to date, we had our open house information. We've had several small group meetings regarding the open house information and the community survey. The consultant has been working on the synthesis report and recommendations, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the meeting for next steps. So we're all furiously working to keep us moving forward in the process. Okay, we are at the tail end of the open house and the community survey, so I'm going to turn this over to Mary to walk us through the some of the high-level numbers and results from our open house. That is still going on until midnight tonight. Do I have that right?
Midnight tonight. Yes. So if you haven't done it and you still want to,
you still
you've
can.
got time. These are results that I'm going to give you as of noon today. I know we've had a couple of additional information we've gotten so far today that obviously aren't going to be in here because they came in after noon, but this is at least what we have for now. We have, as of now, 115 completed surveys, which is more than last time, so that's good. We like to see numbers go up. We added a comment section this time around, which is different than last time. So underneath all of the stations, people can now comment and like or dislike different comments, reply to each other, and that's actually been a lot of people have participated in that, which is really awesome. And I'm glad that we decided to add that function that we didn't have last time, because I think people really appreciated being able to submit their comments, have others in the community reply or thumbs up or thumbs down it. I think it was a really awesome addition. And so we've had at least 65 people comment. And then we had 143 people either comment and or complete the survey. So a good number of people. We have about 68 total comments in between all of the stations, which is quite a lot. And some people commented more than once, so that's pretty fun. And then, like I said, people can vote up or down on comments as well. And so even people that didn't decide to comment were still able to vote on different comments and things, so that we had over 253 votes on the comments as well. So, and then the graphic is just showing bumps of when there was more activity and not throughout the time the survey and open house have been open. And then I'll go into demographic data here. I'm not going to go over each one very specifically, but a couple of things to note is we had, for people that identify as white, we had about 84% take the survey. And then in total, for those that identify as some BIPOC person or person of color, it's about 12%, 12.7% total here. And then I did not include the race or ethnicity, not included, that number at the bottom, because I didn't know what they identified as. So it may bump. This actually might be more than 12% with that addition there. And then I took one other demographic data as well, that was the when people answered their connection to Milwaukee. And you can see there that the two highest numbers are when they live in Milwaukee, that's their connection, or they own a home. And you could select actually more than one of these options. So a possibility of why rent a home is only at 4% here, my theory at least, is maybe because it says rent a home. Somebody could live in an apartment and or another type of housing unit, like we've been talking about for the last year. And so they may have just chosen live in Milwaukee too, or another thing. So there's that to consider as well. We've had quite a few people who work in Milwaukee take the survey, and then also who have religious or cultural activities in Milwaukee as well. Next slide. So I'll do some of initial survey responses. These are just solely survey responses that are one that you can choose. We have a bunch that were open-ended, but we haven't done any analysis on that yet, obviously, because it hasn't closed yet. But when talking about parking, you can see here that option 1 and 2, which is about adding on-street parking, either allowing it solely on-street itself as option 1, option 2 being on-street as well as using your front driveway, kind of as getting the highest in option 2 with the blue, which means 5 most preferred. And then option 3, which was only on-site parking, meaning that street parking isn't allowed to count towards your parking, is pretty significantly, you can see a number of 1s in that green number, which is least preferred. So that's giving us some good information on what people think about parking. And then in terms of the pie chart there, it's asking about how people, if they would support less than 1 parking space per dwelling unit, and that the yellow is no. So you can see there a good half, 53%, are saying no to reducing parking. So that's also really good information for us as well. Next one, Vera. This is a question about building form, and the survey results format is weird because it gave it to me weird. So it's a little small, I apologize. But it's telling us a couple of things too here on what building form people preferred. That top one is about if people preferred the building form to be long and skinny. And there's a lot of green in that one, which is least preferred. So I think people, at least who took the survey, may not like the long and skinny form of building as much as the other two. And option 2 was having stacked, so adding height to allow additional units. That was kind of a little bit all over the place, but you can see the blue there is the highest number, which is most preferred. And then option 3 actually got a lot of people support for, which was splitting into multiple buildings. So that's an interesting insight as well. And then for building form, asking if people would support going to 3 stories if it meant saving a mature tree. Overwhelmingly, people support that with a yes. So that green number, we have a 57% number that were yes, and 32% are an absolute no, and then purple is I don't know, or I don't have an opinion. Next slide. And then this is the final one I'll give you for now. And of course, you'll get more of the final results and analysis as well. But because the survey hasn't closed yet, we don't have that for you. But this is about the site design features and what people find is most important to them. The yellow number, 39%, is building footprint or lot coverage. So how big the building is on your lot was the highest picked one that people found most important. Next is the green, which is size or width of your yards, which I think goes hand in hand there with the lot coverage. If you have a building taking up more of the lot, you have less of a yard or space for yard. So I think that goes hand in hand there. And then just below that is maximum building height. So that's the purple number there at 20%. Beneath that is location of parking. And then the least one is other, but we don't have the responses yet for you all on what their other were, but that gives us some good information. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Mary. So again, these are the preliminary results as of noon today. But I was really happy to see the numbers, you know, of folks that took the survey, participated. The demographic split is much more representative of the city, which is terrific. So I'm happy to see that it does seem that some improvement, definitely an improved amount of engagement and participation, especially in the comments. I hope folks had a chance to go take a look, but we'll have a full analysis and breakdown of all of this stuff at our next meeting when we've had a chance to analyze it. Are there any kind of quick comments about any of that before we move on to the next section? This is my pause that I'm doing.
Wait.
Councilor Beatty?
Yeah, oh, there we go. Sorry, I had a question, which was, you know, we framed this question, Mary, just the way Mary stated it just now, and we framed it this way earlier about, would you agree to more building height if it were needed to save a tree, a mature tree? So could we have a code that said that said, if you're, you know, the building height is 30 feet, unless you're saving a mature tree, and have that defined some way, in which case you're allowed to go higher? Or is that a question that is going to lead to a higher building height recommendation everywhere?
I'll take a stab at that, but I think I'm going to stop the share just so we can kind of all see each other. But I think part of that has to do with how we deal with our design standards and the development standards for the various housing types. So, and I know that what we've been thinking about is kind of a matrix, you know, of standards to make them context sensitive. And I think the way we would be treating this is sort of one of those kinds of options. I'm happy to have Mary or Marcy or Pauline jump in on that, but that's how I'm imagining that would work, that it's not a taller height everywhere. It's intended to be responding specifically to a site-specific condition, if I have that correct. But Marcy, is there anything that I'm missing in that?
Yeah, there are some cities that are using floor area ratio, which is, it's a kind of formula that is a constant. It's basically dictates what the Jell-O mold can be. And there are cities that are using that in the way where they allow you to increase that FAR if you do something. In the case of Portland, they allow you to increase the FAR if you have an additional unit. And if you actually include affordable units, and if there's a very clear definition of what that means for Portland, you get more. I guess so. Maybe I didn't finish the whole circle thought, but you could use that type of tool in the same way if what you want to get is saving a tree.
And I just want to jump in. This is Todd Prager. I'm the consulting arborist for the project. And I've worked on other codes where they have allowed specifically increased building height as a incentive or flexible standard for tree preservation. And it's actually a really important area of flexibility, because sometimes the elevation of the building does need to just increase so you can get above a root zone of a tree, so you don't have to cut roots. And having that ability to even go an extra 5 feet is a good incentive, because I've worked on a lot of projects where, hey, we'd love to preserve this tree, but we have to cut the roots. We can't elevate the building, you know, because we're at the building height limit. And if we could save the tree, but it's not possible. So I think it's a good flexible standard to include in the code for tree preservation.
I see that Matt, you have your hand up, and then we'll move on to the next section. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's like some nuance in like how high a house can go to save a tree. I love the idea of flexibility, and I wanted to report to the group that at the neighborhood meeting where the city presented on our progress, one of the concerns that was raised was, there's already pressure from developers to get, I don't know what it's technically called, some kind of variance or way to like petition to add another story. And so if we're allowing one more story, then the edge being pushed might be one more on top of that. And then you end up with sometimes buildings that are significantly taller than the ones next to them. And so how can we kind of language this to make sure that this doesn't get exploited in a way that we're not intending it to? Thanks.
It's a great question, and sort of understanding kind of how is the flexibility applied, right? And that's going to, I think, rely on how our standards are written, and that they're very clearly written, that the incentive is not so broadly written that anybody can take advantage of it. I think we'll need to be really careful about how we apply those standards and how we understand where and when someone can take advantage of it. You're raising a great point. I don't know that we have an answer right now, but I think that it's going to be something that we'll want to make sure that folks, if they are taking advantage of this incentive, that it's appropriately applied and it's not sort of this willy-nilly everywhere kind of thing. That's not the intent of the standard. Its intent is to do a very specific thing and protect a very specific resource. So we'll want to make sure that we carry that through in the language and we write it very, very carefully. But
Yeah,
it's an excellent point. Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Okay. And continue on with the scope and project review section. So that's Laura and Layla are going to talk with us about that. Let me share my screen.
And while Vera's setting that up, I thought it was really great. I think it was the last meeting and the follow-up, and there was some conversations about looking at the comp plan in its entirety. And I just wanted to take a step back. I think that was a really good point, because we are so far steeped into this portion of the project, which is specifically focused on housing, trees, and parking as it relates to residential in the city, that we kind of forgot to bring you all along with where we are with looking at all of the other pieces of the comprehensive plan and what our plan is for that. And so I put together this kind of overview, and it was in your packet, because right now we are under the complete neighborhood section. We're looking at one portion of the comprehensive plan. There are 12 other sections of the comprehensive plan that we have to implement. And we have a work plan, my staff, along with other city staff, and that goes out at this point almost until, it says 2025 here, but it's already looking like it's 2026. So what we're going to be working on primarily until through 2026, and then possibly even beyond that, is working on this comprehensive plan, right? And so what I wanted to do is just kind of show you how we have it laid out right now. And we've actually taken this work plan to Planning Commission, and we're actually sharing it with City Council next week. So we have this whole plan for how we're going to do this and how we're going to check back in with folks on where we are in the process. And so you can see, those of you who worked on the comprehensive plan, I broke this down to all of the kind of the big headings: fostering community, culture and belonging, environmental stewardship. And you can see where the X's are on the page are the ones that planning is the lead support on. And then, so you can see the big X's, you can see the little X's, and those are where we kind of take a secondary role, but we'll still be really involved. And then where you don't see X's right now, those are the pieces of the plan that are going to be implemented by other departments. And we are working internally to figure out a plan for when we will be doing that work based on their other work that they're doing. So I just wanted to kind of bring you all up to speed that it took many, many years to get started with a vision, right? The city developed a vision, and then the city developed the comprehensive goals and policies. And that took many, many years, and so will implementation. So I just wanted to kind of show you that we are thinking about all of the pieces. We're thinking about them all of the time. And so I just kind of wanted to bring everybody up to speed with that. And then also, The next piece that I don't have a slide for it, but it was in your packet, is we kind of took all of the goals and policies that are outlined just for housing, and we will continue to do this with every single section of the comprehensive plan. And what we've done is we've kind of identified timeframes: near term, midterm, short term, long term, and then who's working on it, what is the status of it, what is the implementation mechanism for that? Is it code? Is it a program? Is it something else? And so we will be tracking every single goal and policy in the comprehensive plan in this manner to make sure that we can report back to you, the rest of the community, Planning Commission, City Council, so we can show how we're making progress on these things. And also, you'll note that I think in the packet, there are other goals and policies, or actually goals and policies, yes, that will be implemented, that are being implemented now, but just not being implemented by this planning core team, which is Vera and myself and Mary and a couple other people. But we've got Layla and her department that takes on a whole nother level of implementing housing goals and policies. And so I'm going to hand it over to Layla to just give a little snapshot of what they're working on that's actually implementing some of the housing goals and policies that are identified through this in this phase of the process.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so the community development team, one of our main responsibilities is implementing City Council's goal related to housing. And so we do that in a number of ways. So we're, well, you're implementing by changing the regulatory framework is one way to do it, and it's probably going to be one of the most impactful. There are some other ways that the city is helping with dealing with particularly housing affordability in terms of income restricted housing. We have few levers in terms of how we can address that. The county actually gets the majority of federal and other funding for housing. They have the housing authority. So we work in partnership. So that's one way, is by having partnerships with the county. We were all deeply involved, for example, in the hillside planning process, and the planning team is obviously involved in how that's working through the land use process. So we do that way. We also engage a lot with developers. So a big part of what I do and what my team do is kind of a development focused arm. So the city owns property, and we have currently 2 in process. So the Coho Point and Kellogg Creek project, and then we're working towards the Sparrow site, where we leverage that property to get housing and also income restricted housing on that property. So we do that through, we call that land banking. So we do the land banking process for that. So that's one other tangible way that we influence that. And there are some other ways that are policy, but kind of more, say, heavy-handed is not the right word, but it's enforceable policy. So for example, the council has for the last 4 years had a policy of, it's in our code for renter protection. So there are protections that are kind of above and beyond the state protection. So it's for no cause evictions. And council is expecting to adopt that permanently in June. So that's one other kind of major tool that we use in terms of like policy. The other way is through incentives and actually financial incentives. So the council passed a construction excise tax. Actually, Sharon Johnson and Celestina Teva were both part of our oversight group that helped set up the criteria for that program. And so the construction excise tax actually is a tax levied on development that's $100,000 or more, both commercial or residential. The state statute guides how we can spend the residential money, but all of that money has to be used towards the development of income restricted affordable housing. And then the council took the additional step of doing that on commercial development. And so that's also intended to be used for, half of that's for affordable housing. And so we are in the process, we're about 90% there, of developing a RFP, so request for proposals, to do a grant for middle housing for the CET program. And we expect and hope to fund, depends on the size of awards, but 2 to 5 projects this first round, and serving all certain income levels, and then having different terms associated with that. So as part of that, we're developing a compliance mechanism in order for us to be able to track that, because most of those projects will be really small scale. They're ideally targeted towards current homeowners or property owners or people who want to implement what comes out of this code. And so I want to time this so that that basically comes out when this code is adopted. So it's a way of the city kind of actively helping to implement the new code, but doing so by providing income restricted housing. And the goal for that is proof of concept. Like, that's the only reason why public sector gets involved in those kinds of transactions, is because we're trying to kind of demonstrate the possibilities to incentivize and catalyze the private sector to come in and do the same thing. And then finally, the other way that we've been using the construction excise tax tool is through an exemption. So it's a foregoing of revenue for projects that are open to providing, and this applies mostly to multifamily, but I know many of you are interested in housing affordability here. But for example, the Coho Point project, where the city is involved in that process, we're in talks with them about, they're planning to provide 10% of their units as affordable. And one of the incentives that we have is that they will forego paying that construction excise tax because they're providing income restricted housing. So those are just a handful of the tools that we use to help address kind of the income restricted side, how we can try to help influence housing development in the city, that I just wanted to share with folks.
Thanks, Layla. And so I just thought I would ask and pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions before we move on to the next item. All right, seeing none, I will pass it back over.
We do have a chat question.
Okay.
Laura.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, it's the question's from Matt, and it's, is there a set percentage of this tax? And Matt, I assume you're talking about the CET that goes to specific.
I think so. There might be other taxes, I'm not sure, but I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, the CET by state statute has to go to, at least the residential side has to go to commercial, sorry, not commercial, to income restricted affordable housing. And then our council dedicated half to housing and then half to economic development. So, so not specifically for parks.
Laura, you muted.
I muted myself instead of unmuting myself. Okay, sorry about that. So we do have system development charges. We don't, but because North Clackamas County Parks and Recreation District runs our parks in the city, so they collect system development charges in order to build out the parks as the city grows and infills. So there is that money for parks set aside. It's just not in our pocket. It's in Clackamas County's North Clackamas pockets, but we work with them to help determine where the best place is to locate the parks based on the development that's infill development that's coming into the city.
Yeah, and any new dwelling unit has to pay system development charges.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mary.
I think Jacob has a question.
I do. I apologize. I have a 4-year-old who apparently hit his head really hard and might be going to urgent care. So I might come back to my question in a minute.
Okay.
All right.
We can save Jacob's question to the end if he's still with us at that point. All right. Anybody else? All right. Seeing none. Okay. I think, Vera, we can move on to the next.
Okay. We're going to talk about parking next. Everyone ready? Let's talk about cars. Let's talk about parking. Okay. I am going to share the presentation, and then we have Rick Williams to take over from here.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Rick Williams.
It's a small bumper, a little bumper.
I'm Rick Williams. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Rick. I was just going to tell Jacob to mute, but he did. You're good.
Okay. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Rick Williams, president of Rick Williams Consulting, and we're the team with Herb's Work was engaged to take a look at parking in traditional residential neighborhoods and how it works in Milwaukee. I'll let you know I'm not very technologically adept, so Vera is going to help me through the PowerPoint. So Vera, next slide. I thought before we jumped into it, first, I know you've been sent a lot of material. This was a pretty technical look at parking, and we've created an inventory summary that I know is in your packet, an occupancy summary, which is really the focus of today. And then there's an executive summary as well, kind of a two-pager that tries to boil down all of this information even more. And what was our task? Our task was to examine how parking typically functions in residential neighborhoods in Milwaukee. This look will help the city better understand residential parking demand because there's decision-making that has to be made going forward, both in the context of the comprehensive plan and the zoning code, but also because of certain state-level mandates that are now in place. Our goal was to estimate the minimum residential demand through an occupancy count in these 4 neighborhoods, and I'll talk about that in a second. And we counted parking occupancy, vehicles actually parked on site and within the public right-of-way on street. So when we counted vehicles for occupancy, if a vehicle was parked illegally, we still counted that as demand. And you'll see a chart here that'll explain that a little bit. Then at the bottom line, our charge was to calculate that residential demand as vehicle demand per residential unit. That's a traditional format for quantifying parking demand that you use in a code format, which is the city will be able to do that with this. Next slide. We collected data in 4 neighborhoods, and working with the city of Milwaukee and Herb's Works, we chose Lakewood, Lake Road, Llewellyn, Ardenwald, and Island Station. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today combines data across the 4 neighborhoods, but there's detailed findings for every individual neighborhood in that parking occupancy summary that you've been given. It's dated February 2021 version 1, and I know you have it. So there's a lot of detail, a lot of data, but we'll try to make it as simple as possible tonight and take questions. Vera? Let's talk about our methodology first. There's a certain way to get at these numbers. So first we have to look at the supply, or what we call the inventory of parking. You know, what is the actual designated physical capacity for parking in an area? So we went out and identified every parking stall, both on and off street. And in neighborhoods that didn't have improved roads, we actually took our measuring wheels out there and a traffic engineer and physically wheeled off parking spaces. But as you can see from this graphic, there's lots of different places people can park. There's the on-street parking, there's parking in driveways, and then as you can see in the lower left-hand corner of this graphic, there's actually parking in garages. And that's going to allow us then to understand how much parking is physically available to residential units. And so to do that, you saw in the inventory summary, we also had to identify all land uses in the areas that were non-residential and any parking associated with those non-residential uses to assure that only residential parking demand is actually counted. And then, by the way, we also identified every residential unit within each of these study areas so that we had all residential units and all physical residential parking. Vera? So like I said, when we did now that we have the supply, we had to actually go out and physically count parked cars. And we did this at both 10 a.m. and 2 a.m. Within the industry, the parking industry, 2 a.m. generally represents the highest level of demand for residential parking. The assumption being that at this time of night, all other parkers in the area who are not residential or living in the area would have left. And so that's the 2 a.m. residential peak demand count. Then we did the 10 a.m. count to just simply validate any changes that might occur against the traditional peak demand at 2 a.m. to make sure there weren't any anomalies. Another thing that we didn't do, we were able to assess all of the inventory and we included garages. But because most of the doors were closed on the garages, we took that estimated supply and out of our counts because we couldn't see what was behind those garage doors. And so that's why we're tracking a minimum residential parking demand. And interestingly, because this happened a lot, as you can see from the graphic, we quantified every vehicle that was parked. And so you can see there's parking on street, the cars in blue, parking in what would be designated parking areas like a driveway or a carport. Those cars are black on this. But you can also see in the bottom left-hand corner, I'm sorry, not bottom left-hand corner, you can see the brown cars. We actually found a lot of sites where vehicles were parked on site in areas not designated for parking, on grass, in a ditch, or behind a physical dwelling unit. So again, I said we counted every vehicle parked, no matter where it was parked, to get the true demand. Next slide, Vera.
Can I ask a question?
Vera? Is this time for a question?
Sorry, I was muted. Councilor Beatty, sure.
I just want to make sure I understood what you said. You counted garages when you saw a garage door as capacity, but you did not count whether it was occupied or not.
Correct. And we kind of have two supply numbers. We have the supply that we could physically see and the cars parked in that supply. We also then have a supply of parking that we estimated. So if a garage had, looked like the two-door garage, we'd assume it had a capacity for 2 cars. We took that inventory out because we couldn't assume the demand in that. So that's why, again, at the bottom line, we have a minimum residential demand, minimum vehicle demand per residential unit, because we don't know what's behind those doors.
Okay. And we
So
do know, I mean, I can at least tell you that in Island Station, many of those garages are not used for cars.
Right. They're used for storage.
They're used for storage, and in some cases, they're used for rec rooms. They're kids' playrooms, things like that. They've been converted.
Thank you, Councilor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councilor. But it's important. Your question was really important because we want to understand that the demand number that we have tonight is directly associated to that supply that was physically accessible. Okay, so then moving on, again, we used an industry best practice for measuring residential demand, which are those 2 a.m. counts. And we measured a lot of different metrics within our counts. So the way we parse the data, and again, we can parse it, like as you probably saw in the reports, we have a lot of data. But first thing we wanted to make sure was that we separated the residential from non-residential supplies. And at 2 a.m., there was not a lot of non-residential parking out there, but we actually separated residential supply from non-residential supply from residential so that we could keep the demand number pure to residential. We counted occupancy in a lot of different ways, in total, combined, on-street, on-site, and then we also compiled occupancy by block, by single block, to see if we could see any patterns. And you can see that in the larger report with a lot of the heat maps that we put in. Again, we quantified then the vehicle demand per residential unit to get that minimum demand number that some of these new state mandates and the code needs are requiring of us. But then also, I'll show you something interesting here in a second. We also quantified the number of vehicles parked on each individual site to just get a sense of how people were parking. In an earlier discussion with folks from the city, there was some concerns expressed about the impact of COVID on the parking counts. Well, from a residential perspective, COVID actually doesn't create problems for us in measuring demand because we're seeing more and more and hearing from other cities as well as Portland, Milwaukee, that more and more vehicles are actually staying home now during COVID. And so our 2 a.m. peak occupancy number probably is not affected by COVID itself, and which probably means our parking demand numbers are more conservative. Now, COVID will affect what's I would call the non-residential demand. It's likely lower, so I think some of the reasons we saw, as you'll see, lower on-street occupancies is because visitors and non-residential travelers into neighborhoods to recreate or go to a park or something like that are not represented well in this. But because our goal is to get a residential demand number, we don't believe there's a lot of impact of COVID on this task. Even though there is lower demand for non-residential because of COVID. So our key objective, of course, is to get a demand number for vehicles per residential unit. Vera? So because there's so much parking out there, I mean, not parking, so there's so much data that we put together into these documents, I thought I'd try to walk you through some just examples of what's in the report. So the first thing we started with is you can see the 4 neighborhoods are across the top of this table: Lake Road, Llewellyn, Ardenwald, and Island Station, as individual neighborhoods and then combined in total. And we looked at the supply of parking. So if you were to ask how much parking was physically available, whether there were cars parked in or not, just how much parking was available, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's about 4 parking stalls available per dwelling unit in these neighborhoods. And you can see it varies a bit across the bottom. Llewellyn had the highest amount of supply at 4.93 stalls per unit, and Ardenwald had the lowest. Their supply was about a little over 30 stalls per unit, and those stalls break out between that which is on site and that which is on street. The average on site parking, Vera, if you click it. Oh, okay, the average on-site parking is about 1.87 stalls per unit. So it's about, half and half. About 1.87 stalls are on-site, and then about 2 stalls per unit are on street. Next slide. So now if we look at demand, so that was the supply. Now we're looking at the actual vehicles parked in the supply. And you can see that the average minimum demand is about 1.992 vehicles per unit. And that's fairly consistent across the neighborhoods. So as you can see in that bottom row, Lake Road and Ardenwald have the highest demand of just a little over 2 vehicles per unit. Llewellyn has the lowest at 1.89 vehicles per unit, and Island Station at 1.95. But there's not a lot of variation, really, if you think about it, across the neighborhoods. The on-site demand, next click. The on-site demand is about 1.5 vehicles per unit. So about 1.5 cars per unit are actually physically parked at the peak hour at 2 a.m. The on-street demand is pretty low, about 0.48 vehicles per unit. But what I find interesting is if you look at Lake Road, so the on-street demand is 0.48 vehicles per unit, but in Lake Road, 0.89 vehicles are parked on street, and Lake Road has some of the lowest on-site demand at 1.16 vehicles per unit. So you can see that in that first column for Lake Road. And then we're speculating that Lake Road also has some of the more improved streets among the 4 neighborhoods. The other neighborhoods, they have lots of streets that are not well improved, like with curbs and curb cuts and things like that. And so it kind of leads us to speculate that even though the total vehicle demand at about 2 stalls per unit is consistent across the 4 neighborhoods, where you have improved streets, the residents have more of a tendency to want to park on street. Next slide. So another example from Llewellyn. Llewellyn had the highest amount of supply at 4.93 stalls per unit, but it had the lowest demand at 1.8 stalls, 8.9 stalls per unit. So just because you have supply doesn't mean you have demand that is different than in the other neighborhoods. And so as you can see by the gray hatched areas, the 4.93 in supply, and then the 1.89 at the peak hour for total demand. And then to the right, the two columns to the right, you can see that 1.6 of that demand is on driveways and about 0.29 is on street. So again, this is an interesting finding in the Wheeling. You know, supply doesn't necessarily mean that your demand is going to be different. Next slide. So this is from Ardenwald. So I kind of reversed the question. Where we had the lowest overall supply, which was in Ardenwald at a little over 3 stalls per residential unit, our demand didn't change much. So Ardenwald has the lowest overall parking supply, but its overall parking demand at just a little over 2 stalls per unit, again, falls within that average for all 4 neighborhoods. What was interesting though about Ardenwald is you can see in the third column that the on-site driveway demand is very close to what the supply of on-site parking is. And again, this doesn't include garages, remember that, but this would just be areas on-site like driveways that are truly designated for parking. So Ardenwald came closest in terms of its on-site demand is closest to its parking supply. The other 3 neighborhoods really didn't display that. Next slide. We also, because of one of those earlier graphics I showed you, that we were counting parked cars in places that were not designated truly for parking. We did this illustration to show how the number of vehicles distribute across residential units. And in Island Station, there's a high percentage of units that have 3 or more vehicles parked on site at the peak hour. About 18% of all residential units have 3 or more vehicles parked. In the upper row, in the 10 o'clock row, you can see that that goes down a bit at 10 a.m. and that's a sign of what we call the reverse commute. You can see that the number of vehicles parked on specific sites actually goes down as a graphic because people are going to work or going shopping or leaving the home. But again, it's also interesting, Ardenwald actually had a higher number of vehicles parked on site of 3 or more vehicles. About 23%, 24% of all units in Ardenwald have that, display that pattern. Next slide. So what does this all boil down to? The minimum average parking demand is approximately 2 vehicles per residential unit. And like we said, it doesn't vary much across the 4 neighborhoods. So we didn't see a lot of change in terms of the overall vehicle demand. This includes the finding that about 1.5 of that demand, vehicles per unit, is occurring on site. But in no cases was the demand ever in excess of the physical capacity, whether that capacity was on site or on street. Ardenwald came close, as I showed you in a previous graphic, but we didn't see any significant constraints on parking. The on-street system, as we said, has low demand at this time. We think it's a little higher in Lake Road because of the quality of the streets, and that therefore the available supply in the on-street system could be absorbed by new growth, or post-COVID, we could see a lot of those non-residential users coming back to the neighborhoods. As I said, much of the on-street supply is unimproved. So a lot of the, not a lot, but some of the supply numbers that we've estimated might go down a bit if the streets were improved for curbs and paving and making safe areas for people to park. But that wouldn't change the demand number. And we didn't see in any case where it would necessarily create significant constraints for improving the streets. But we did see, if our assumption about Lake Road was correct, that if you improve streets, more people would tend to park on street and not on site. As we said, in the 2 neighborhoods, there was a high percentage or a notable percentage of residential units that had 3 or more vehicles parking on site. We don't think that's something that might translate with the new types of housing that are being proposed in the middle housing. That's just the current state of affairs in the neighborhoods at this time. And finally, we would say that our data suggests that minimum compliance is the approach that the city should take to meet the state mandates. And what minimum compliance means is the state is allowing cities to be flexible, from going all the way to eliminating parking minimums completely, or to have some variation to their existing codes. Minimum compliance, according to the state, means that the city cannot require more than a total of 1 off-street space per dwelling unit. So we would recommend the city go with that approach. That's as high as the city can go, but it also then provides parking on site at the minimum compliance standard. Minimum also allows a developer, that's just the minimum that the city could require per the mandate. Developers could provide more. The minimum doesn't prevent developers from providing more on site. With that, I'd open it to questions.
I'll start with some of the chat questions that came in while you're presenting, Rick.
Sure.
So the first one was from Counselor Beatty asking, 10 a.m. and 2 a.m., were they always on weekdays?
Yeah, we generally do them on weekdays for residential because, believe it or not, in other cities we've shown if you do a weekend count, there's more of a tendency on weekends for people to go on vacation or leave home, and sometimes the best peak of the peak is actually a weekday. Some people would say, well, why didn't you do it on a weekend? Because theoretically more people would be home, but statistically that's not the case.
And I think you answered Stefan's question about what is minimum compliance just now.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we'll move on. Oh, go Stefan.
Yeah, that was answered. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then if you have other questions, raise your hand or do the raise hand function. I think okay. We'll do Counselor Beatty, Renee, and then I think I saw Eugene as well.
Yeah, I just had a couple clarifying questions. One
Sure.
is when there was the slide up, one of the early slides that had the 4 neighborhoods and the number of houses.
Yeah.
You didn't do the whole neighborhood. You did a chunk of the neighborhood, I take it, because Ardenwald is easily,
Oh, yeah.
3 times
Correct.
the size of Island Station. So you just did a chunk of Ardenwald.
Right. What we tried to do, we worked with the city and with Herbsworks in those 4 neighborhoods to get what was considered a representative sample of each neighborhood, that quality of streets, type of units, etc. But the overall database, we believe, is statistically significant.
And then the other thing is I wanted to understand a little more about what you said about separating residential from non-residential.
Yeah.
And that comes to mind, especially with Ardenwald and 32nd Avenue. Well, actually lots of parts of Ardenwald. So since we don't know exactly what your chunk of Ardenwald was, there's lots of parts of Ardenwald that do have non-residential uses in there that, will presumably have higher demand after COVID. I think about Olson Street and 32nd, I think about around Milwaukee Cafe, but I'm sure the people who live in Ardenwald can probably name others too.
Yeah, but you ask good questions. Again, if those new demands came back, they would be non-residential. And even though they have impacts on a neighborhood, our task was to derive a pure minimum residential parking demand. So we know now what the residential demand is, but any backfill that could happen from non-residential uses, spillover from other neighborhoods or areas could continue to occur after COVID, but it wouldn't impact statistically our measurement of what is residential demand for those living in those units.
Well, not the demand, but the capacity.
Yeah, and that's why we said that 10 a.m. number is interesting to us, because there is a lot of on-street capacity. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the situation normally there, but it doesn't affect our demand number for this task.
I want to just jump in and mention, to add to what you said, Rick, about minimum compliance, that to add to your statement that it is 1 dwelling, the city is only going to be able to require 1 space on site per dwelling unit. But I want to add that they're also going to be able to allow that space to be on street and still count as the one required space. There's going to be that additional flexibility for the parked car.
All right, I think I saw Renee's hand, then we'll do Eugene, then Micah. Just keep it going.
Yeah, I just was wanting a clarification on one of the points on your last slide.
Mhm.
And it had to do, I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly, and you took that down. So I think it was the second to last one. It had to do with your conclusion about the people parking on the lot, that wouldn't be the same somehow with middle housing.
We're not assuming one way or the other. We just use those two examples in the Ardenwald and the Llewellyn neighborhood that had a high percentage of units now that have more than 3 vehicles parked on site.
Okay, but you made a statement that you didn't think that was going to be applicable to what we're talking about currently with the middle housing, no?
Right. Well, we can't speculate one way or the other. My sense is if you're putting more density on a site, there's going to be less room. I don't know if people are going to come into the neighborhood with that many cars because they don't have the space, because most of that is happening on site. But if it didn't, then it would translate back to the on-street system.
Okay, so that's why I'm asking. I'm wondering if in any of the neighborhoods, and I'm sorry, I didn't look at the specific neighborhoods and think about what kind of streets they represent. But if we're in your sample spots, were there any neighborhoods that don't have the possibility of on-street parking?
I think there's block faces in those neighborhoods where on-street parking, and we would have to go back into, I can't give you specific examples, but the answer is, yeah, there are certain block faces where the frontage that a house abuts to the street doesn't have parking. But it's not a significant amount of those neighborhood, at least the study areas that we had. But yeah, we had, and those are identified in our inventory tables. If you go to the inventory report, we can show you block face by block face where the parking is on street and where it's not allowed.
Right, but I guess, you're doing overall numbers, which I completely get, because the code is for, not for specific lots. But I'm concerned about neighborhoods like my own. I live on Johnson Creek Boulevard, that are anomalies to what we've been talking about. And if in your recommendations, there's specific flexibility for specific zones that don't have options.
Well, that's a great point. I think I would let either Marcy might want to answer that, because within the mandate itself, it's tough. But, there are nuances, because we have situations, I wish we could have got inside of those garages. Because we have a situation where you could require 1 space on site, but they provide a driveway and a garage. Well, that's a capacity for 2. So I think your point about flexibility is a good one. I would need more help from Marcy in terms of how that translates into the mandate of 1 space.
I think one, it may be overly simple answer to Renee, your question is that on a street where on-street parking doesn't exist, and a homeowner or a developer wants to add some units on a lot on that street, they will simply have to provide all the parking on site. And nothing will prevent them from doing that. The city will not require them to do that, but they can choose to do that. Does that help? I'm not seeing any expression.
I'll jump in here if I can. Rick, I appreciate the depth of your study here, but I think probably what's needed is a footnote or an asterisk that says we've got streets like Johnson Creek Road, 42nd, 43rd, 30 second, that don't lend themselves to on-street parking. Some of them are not in your study areas.
That's a
And
great point.
I think it's really important.
No, I think it's a really good point. Thank you.
All right, we'll do Eugene, Micah, and then I see Sharon as well.
Thank you. Rick, I'm wondering if you had any other databases to look at. In other words, previous assessments of parking demand and supply within the last 20 years that perhaps had been done by previous city councils and planning departments. Because to me, it's really important to recognize a trend that is occurring in a community. Thank you.
Real quick, we don't have a lot of databases for Milwaukee, so we give the city a lot of credit for conducting this study to actually get into real neighborhoods and do it. Through our firm, we've done scores of residential studies in other cities for the last 15 years. And we see trends and, you know, can compare cities. But I agree with you right now that this is sort of your first baseline. And again, the fact that the city went ahead and said, let's actually get some real data from Milwaukee is a good start.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Micah, go ahead.
I've really appreciated this this study of the existing conditions. And as I think about our project, which is future vision, and a vision that might be more urban and less car-centric, do you have, and that this project is going to, the development that comes from it is going to be very piecemeal. Do you have good, are there good examples that show like how quickly residents adapt to new parking constraints in supply, and what we can expect around that?
Boy, I'm going to waffle on you, Micah, and say not really, because there's so many factors that affect, you know, car ownership and proximity to transit. But we do know that where high frequency transit has huge synergistic effects on neighborhoods. So future planning for transit in Milwaukee. But a lot of it is price point. One, is the housing affordable first? And then what are the transit and alternative mode options, proximity to work options, et cetera, available? So there's good examples out there, and maybe we can communicate. I can give you cities that have done more elaborate work on the relationship between infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, its impact on the use of parking in residential developments. A great website for everyone is sightlines.org. They're a think tank that is focused on issues like this, and they can give you really good examples as well. It so varies by city, though. It's hard to, you know, create a straight line.
Can I mention that in the frequently asked questions, the first edition, we did link to Governing Magazine. I think that was an article, Rick, that you linked to. There's a very useful analysis of national trends around car ownership in relationship to other trends. I would recommend you read that.
Right. And if you'd like, and even back to Eugene's point, if it's kosher with Vera, if you want studies that we've done in the past in other cities on residential, we'd be glad to provide those too. But there's a lot of good information out there, and thank you, Marcy, for that.
All right, Sharon, go ahead.
My question is around what seems to be the focus on individual property and the capacity for individual property owners to accommodate parking. And it seems to me that parking is one of those issues that is more block wide or block sensitive. Mm-hmm. And so I see you shaking your head, yes, Rick. So maybe I'll just kind of leave the question open and let you respond to that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And that's why we would really direct people to go to the full occupancy report, because of the code, we needed to get to that minimum vehicles per unit number. But in the individual neighborhoods, through our heat maps, we show you how the parking is being distributed across a whole block so that all of the residential units within a block captured kind of working, I don't say working together, but how they interact together. So that data is available, Sharon, and I think it's really a good point that you bring up. This requires us to boil it right down to the unit, but the data, and I think, again, having this baseline that the city's put together is really good, as we were able to display it on a heat map by block.
Can
it
I
gives you
just
more holistic.
jump in? Because Sharon, you posted a question, and it's actually about creative solutions. And I think while we have Rick, it might be useful to have you briefly describe some creative solutions to, if your question was, are there examples of creative parking solutions, especially as we look at increased multi-unit, like mini parking lots? Or does this survey say that is not needed?
No, it wouldn't. It's how you address the requirement. I'm working on a project in Vancouver now, Vancouver Heights, that actually did separate the parking from the units and create areas where it was like a surface lot for individual residential units, probably trying to deal with issues like not having on-street frontage and things. So yeah, there are lots of ways in the design factor. It'd be that nuance and flexibility that people talked about before, is can we assemble minimum requirements and distribute them differently throughout a block or throughout a smaller area of the neighborhood for shared use. So yeah, there are those opportunities, but that gets into the details and the nuance of when we were even talking about the thing about trees. Can we create incentives and bonuses, for instance, for doing things like that?
Jacob, go for it.
Thanks, Rick. Hi, everybody. Jacob Sherman from the Planning Commission. I am the alternate to the alternate tonight. Rick, I was curious on the topic of flexible kind of solutions. Do you know, are you aware of any kinds of examples where when a development is going in, the developer is often required to put parking on site or make frontage improvements on site, but the city can't make improvements further down the block, not necessarily on their property. Are you aware of any examples in other jurisdictions where there might be those creative solutions around making other street frontage improvements in order to reduce parking minimums on site?
Not off the top of my head, but I could go find them, I'm sure. I think the Vancouver Heights example was the first example I had, is where they were trying to, and I'm not sure how that was coming together with developers, because it's a large master plan site now with the city and a large group of developers. I think that the approach was taking requirements and assembling them, and then using those to serve the entire site is something to keep looking at, and that flexibility going forward. But I think this whole thing that we're going through with middle housing, it's occurring all over the United States, is such new territory that I think putting some flexible ideas on the table is another way to approach it.
Maybe just this quick follow-up. I live off of 32nd and Olson, which was in your survey area. Yeah. And we have a development that's coming in, and I remember during the land use process, a number of neighbors really concerned about kind of additional parking. But a number of folks were saying, we'd be willing to, let more on-street parking occur if we actually had a street that was improved.
Right.
Yet there was no mechanism for the city to be able to kind of require that. So yeah, I'd be very curious to hear any other ideas that you might have.
Well, really quickly on that one, it's a proximity issue. But there's, again, it goes back to that flexibility in the code of if I don't have street frontage and I don't want to put it on site, where can I put it? And can it be on street? Then if you're talking about how far away from the site, and would a user use it, and would it be marketable is another question. So again, those are all challenges, but I love the fact that people want to think creatively. It's just assembling those requirements, and then can we do something more flexible with them?
All right, I see Councillor Beatty's hand, and then I think we'll move on from here unless there's last minute questions, and then we'll have some poll questions as well.
Micah had his hand up first, or is that just left over?
I forgot to take it down, sorry.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I heard something right, which was you said Lake Road was an example of where this there was more utilization of the street parking, and you sort of thought that might be because of the the better quality of the streets, the curb.
Right. Right, Counselor, but that was my own bias. We looked at all the neighborhoods and said, what are the biggest, why is the on-street parking higher in Lake Road, but its overall demand is the same?
Yeah.
So I speculated and talked to my surveyors, and we looked at the photos of the, all of the areas that we surveyed. And one big difference was Lake Road had more improved on-street parking. So that was my own speculation. That because if the demand number was completely different, I might have surmised something else or assumed something else. But the fact that Lake Road was right in that 2 vehicles per unit range, but they had really highest on-street parking compared to the other neighborhoods, is my assumption that it was the improved streets. That people
I'll have to look at what part of Lake Road
right
you're in, but there are some parts of Lake Road that are also
unimproved.
Well,
Correct.
there are some parts that are unimproved, but I was going to say there are substantial parts of Lake Road that have pretty large driveways and pretty large garages. That they're still utilizing more street parking than in other neighborhoods that tend to have, smaller parcels and smaller garages. I thought was interesting. But you also said that that bringing street improvements to unimproved streets could reduce some capacity because of curb cuts and things. And that makes perfect sense. Do you know anything? I mean, one thing that's always bothered me, and I live in a neighborhood where a lot of people are parking not on pavement, is the environmental impacts of having cars parking not on pavement, and sort of what that means for what's dripping into our groundwater, and et cetera, et cetera. Do you have any information on that?
No, unfortunately, I don't. That's above my pay grade on that one, the environmental side. Todd might. But thank you for the question.
Hey, Rick, can you quickly define improved streets?
Yeah, from our perspective, it would be a curb with a paved curb cut, an adequate distance from the curb to the street to allow safe traffic flow, a level surface, paved road. In general, I think that's my quick definition of an improved road from a parking perspective.
Perfect, thanks.
You bet.
Okay, thank you, Rick. It's terrific, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're going to have you folks take a poll, because we really like doing the poll questions, and we thought taking a little quick break and ask a couple of poll questions related to parking, since we just had this presentation, just to kind of see where folks are at on a couple of questions about parking as it relates to our project in middle housing. So we're going to fire up one of our questions. Mary. So having heard the results of the parking study, I agree that requiring 1 parking space per unit within the front yard setback, and remember our code right now requires that parking space is outside the front yard setback, but you agree that parking space inside that front yard setback is sufficient. Yes, no, or need more information? And if you do need more information, if you could throw it into the chat so we have a sense of what folks are still need to know about.
It won't allow me to vote.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, I was wondering if that was a problem. Hold on.
You guys are usually really quick to like.
Yeah, it says hosts and panelists can't vote.
Only the
Well,
public.
that's not good. Okay, one second.
Talk amongst yourselves. Wow, I get that fixed.
We were so good about getting the questions all loaded up this time so that Mary didn't have to do them on the fly like we did last time.
That's right.
Okay, I'm gonna try a different parking question and see if what I did to change it made a difference. So 1 second. Oh, okay. I know what I did wrong now. Never mind. Let's go to the second one, and then I'll have to re-upload the first parking question, Vera. Sorry.
No worries. Okay, question 2. Having heard the results of the parking study, I agree that code updates should allow parking on streets where appropriate to count towards some of the residential parking requirements. And again, if you need more information, please add that into the chat. It's working because people are voting, so that's awesome. Thanks. All right. I think all of the committee members have voted.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
All right. There you go.
All right. So 75%, we do have a majority. It's not everyone. So if you have some comments about why you think, or in what kinds of situations maybe you don't think on-street parking should count towards some of the residential parking requirements, maybe put your comments into the chat. And so we can just have a sense of, what are some of the concerns that folks still have about that. And that's fine. This is what we need to know as we put together the parking requirements for the code. All right. Thanks very much. All right. We go back to the first question. Mary. Okay. So back to question number 1 about that you agree that it's okay to have 1 parking space per unit, and that it's okay that it's in the front yard setback, that is sufficient.
Where is it? Where did it go?
And again, if you need more information, if there's something else that you need to know, and it's easy-ish to put in the chat, go ahead and include that.
Okay, I think we're there.
Okay.
Well, I already voted on that one, but I would want a kind of a special note about that assumes that it's actually a parking space as compared to the lawn.
Yes, correct. No lawn, not lawn parking. Driveway. It essentially means that your parking space is your driveway.
Got it.
Correct. Sorry. Thank you, Stefan. That's a good clarification. Terrific. Okay, so we have a majority, but not quite as clear. So it looks like folks need a little bit more information. And it looks like from Councilor Beatty, it would depend on the size of the unit. Okay. And then if I can from Renee, there needs to be more discussion on considerations in the neighborhood mixed use areas and the neighborhood hubs as it relates to parking. Okay. Nope. That's a good point. All right. Thank you, Mary, for the polling. Okay. So that's our little transition time. We're going from parking. Can I close out of that polls window? Okay. So now we're leaving parking, we're leaving pavement, we're going to trees next. So next phase is we're going to plant material. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and we're going to the tree code. And Todd, you're up.
All right. Thank you, Vera. Good evening, everyone. I'm Todd Prager. I'm the consulting arborist for the consultant team. And I'm a board certified master arborist, registered consulting arborist, and I'm also a certified planner. I've worked on several tree codes throughout the Portland region, a little bit in California, and for cities, updating tree codes. I did a complete overhaul of the Tigard code, working on several minor tree code updates in the region. And I also work as a private consultant on development projects. So I work with tree codes all across the region from the private side. So I think I have a good perspective on what works and what doesn't as far as tree codes. Just from a big picture perspective, my role in this project is really to integrate tree preservation and planting with the development of middle housing. And before I kind of get into the details of what we're doing, I always think it's helpful to kind of list some of the benefits of trees, why we're doing this, why we care about preserving trees and planting trees. Trees really provide a great sense of place, a sense of community. They provide shade, they capture carbon that can really support the city's goals, especially towards their climate change goals. Trees help to improve air quality. They can help manage stormwater, soil erosion, protect water quality. They have a really important function too of screening and buffering new development from existing development. So help just when new development occurs in a community that it's not so stark to the existing neighborhood. And then trees provide also an important wildlife habitat, food and cover for really a variety of species in our region. Next slide. So I wanted just to kind of briefly go through where Milwaukee's been as far as tree preservation and urban forestry. The city's adopted, of course, as you know, the comp plan. There's a healthy urban forest goal in there, goal 3.4. It provides kind of that high level policy foundation for the work that's happening here. There's also a climate action plan that really highlights the importance of trees in combating climate change. The city's also adopted an urban forest management plan that has some more detail on things such as forest size, forest health, tree age and species diversity. So all of this planning background has been really good. And I've said throughout this, I'm really impressed that the city is building their code upon this really strong policy foundation. So it can be anchored in these different planning documents. So the city recently adopted a public tree code that regulates the preservation and planting and protection of trees on city property, as well as in streets, the public right of way. And now we are moving towards the private tree code part that's going to deal with the protection and preservation and planting of trees on private property. That's the next slide. So as we've gone through this process, I've been working with the tree board and staff over the last few months. And there's been sort of some big picture guiding principles that have really helped focus our efforts and kind of lead us to where we're going. First is the big picture goal for the city is to provide 40% citywide tree canopy by the year 2035. So the image at the top of the screen is the distribution of the city's existing tree canopy. The city's currently at 26%. So the goal is to get another 14% by the year 2035. Another important fact is that 80% of the city's tree canopy is on private property. So that's why it's really important for the city to address preservation and planting of trees on private property, because that's where the vast majority of the trees are in Milwaukee. Another important factor down, if you look at the zoning map towards the bottom of the page, is that most of the city is zoned residential. So as part of this project, the regulations for trees are going to be focused on residential properties, which encompasses a majority of the land area of the city. So if you go to the next slide, Vera.
Todd, can I jump in and just correct one thing? So it's not 2035, it's 2040 on the 40% canopy goal.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Yep.
So, you know, a really important factor in this with the, as we've gone through this with the tree board, is that not all tree canopy is created equal. So the tree board really wants to place an emphasis on the preservation and the planting of really high quality tree canopy. So looking at things such as long-lived native species, large mature trees, trees that are climate resilient or can withstand the impacts of climate change over the years. Generally trees that are going to provide these long-term benefits. So trees such as invasive species or short-lived trees are not so much the focus of what the tree board's interested in. This slide here kind of goes through an example of what we're talking about. So if you look at the top of the picture, towards the top middle part, there's a nice grove of what looks to be mostly Douglas fir in that area. And those are the types of trees that would be the focus of the preservation efforts. And then, if you look towards the kind of bottom middle and bottom left of the screen, there's kind of an example of a new development. It looks to be a newer construction going on. Maybe to the left, there's some newer homes that have been constructed, but there's really not much tree canopy in that area. So at the bottom of the screen is the same area of development with the larger Douglas firs in the background, provide that nice canopy, but some of the newer homes really don't have much tree canopy. So the tree board's looking just for some more compatibility between these new developments and the existing kind of character of these neighborhoods. So next slide, please. So I wanted to just go through the general outline of the tree code and where this effort is moving towards and just kind of how the tree code is structured. So the first is tree codes typically have a purpose statement, talk about the benefits of trees, why trees are being regulated, provide that connection between the policy documents such as the comprehensive plan, urban forest management plan, and how those the tree code implements those larger planning policies. Next slide. And then the applicability, or where the regulations would apply. In this case, it would apply to residential zones. And also the types of development where it would apply would be the increase in needed housing, including middle housing, land divisions, where the housing supply is being increased, but also where there is demolition and new construction of existing housing. Next slide. So the tree preservation standards for this code are going to be kind of the main focus of what the code regulates. The tree board, it really prioritized the preservation of existing trees and to preserve that existing canopy first, and then build upon that potentially with additional plantings to get to that 40% goal. But preservation of existing trees is the main focus, creating really standards that identify where those priority trees are, such as the long-lived trees, the native trees, and identifying what those priorities are. And then allowing removal only in cases where removal is required for development purposes. Also having kind of a backstop for minimum preservation standards. We discussed a 33% preservation of canopy of those priority trees for new development. But the proposal right now is not to go to that minimum preservation requirement, but to only remove what's needed for construction, but no more than 33%. In some cases, that may not be possible to preserve those minimums. Maybe a tree is right where a road alignment is stubbed out, and that's the only tree on the property. So in some cases where there's no alternatives to meeting those standards, then mitigation would be required. Mitigation requirements are proposed to be pretty significant so that developers really think about where they really need to remove a tree before doing it. And there are fees and examples in other cities, including City of Portland, that really discourage the removal of trees and require developers to really consider if there's alternatives to removal. We've also discussed a discretionary alternative. So if there's cases where a developer were to propose things such as maybe a green roof, maybe doing habitat restoration as an alternative to paying mitigation fees, then that could be considered by the Planning Commission following a recommendation from the tree board. And then of course, requiring trees that are preserved and identified to be adequately protected during construction. Next slide, please. In addition to tree preservation requirements, we've also discussed having tree canopy standards. So in some cases, there may not be any existing trees on a site. And in those cases, for example, it wouldn't mean that the development was not subject to the tree code, but there would be a requirement to plant new trees to meet the city's canopy requirements. So new development would be required to plant trees in support of the city's kind of citywide canopy goals. And again, we talked about quality trees, making sure that they're long-lived species, priority trees that the city wants to see for the long term. In addition to planting trees, it's really important that the trees be provided conditions that allow them to grow for the long term. So providing especially adequate soil volumes and making sure that soil resources are protected during construction from things like compaction and contamination, so that when trees are planted, they can grow and thrive for the long term. And also if those areas can't be protected for whatever reason, that there is kind of soil restoration that occurs as documented and approved by an arborist on the team. If for whatever reason the canopy standards can't be met, there could be a mitigation requirement, a fee in lieu, and then as an alternative to fees, there could be also this parallel kind of discretionary alternative for, rather than planting trees, doing things like the green roof, habitat restoration, and those types of alternatives. Next slide, please. So after going through these standards, typically want to lay out submittal requirements so that the city can have something that they review, requiring certifications from an arborist to be involved on projects, site plan requirements, laying out, the types of trees, size requirements of trees that are assessed, which in this case, we discussed trees to 6-inch trunk diameter to be identified as part of development, possibly smaller with some species that are priority, such as Oregon white oak or Pacific madrone could be identified at a smaller trunk diameter. Next slide. Of course, the definition section's important to define those terms that may not be clear, so everyone is under the same understanding. And then next slide. Enforcement, and this is a really important part of it, that lays out what are the penalties for doing things like cutting down trees that were supposed to be preserved, so it's not easy just to get around code requirements. And then this is an important factor too, is to really specify that the city is the decision maker on what, how they interpret the code on things such as what are priority trees, are the canopy requirements met, and just make it clear that that's the city's ultimate decision and not necessarily the applicant. Next slide. In addition to these development regulations, because this code proposal is so preservation focused, it's really important to have a non-development regulations so that people can't get around the standards by doing things like cutting down all their trees before they come in for a development application, which does happen when there's not non-development regulations. Or on the flip side, after development's complete, going ahead and somebody removing all their trees after the development's completed. So an important component because of the preservation requirements will be these non-development permit requirements. Next slide. This was just, I just wanted to provide you was an example that the tree board actually put together that shows that we don't want to look at tree preservation kind of in black and white and see all tree canopy as equal, but to take a more nuanced approach down towards the lower side half of the page, looking at identifying those priority trees, such as an example would be the ones in green, and citing your development in a way that preserves those trees and sacrificing these lower value trees that may be nuisance species or unhealthy trees, hazardous trees, etc. Next slide. So the main challenges for this project moving forward, or this piece of the project, is going to be kind of meeting that goal of preserving quality tree canopy and defining what those priority trees are that the city wants to preserve and plant, and doing that in a way that's a clear and objective code process, which is required by state law, and also making the code understandable so it's not so complex that people are confused on what needs to be done. Also, another challenge is just kind of landing on that right level of tree preservation and future tree canopy so that new development kind of has that right fit of the level of trees, and also making sure that existing neighborhoods are protected from things like excessive tree removal. So there's that compatibility piece. Another challenge is going to be trying to figure out what those lists of appropriate species are. We don't know how climate change will affect all different kinds of tree species. So we're going to need to do our best on developing a list, but then we've talked about having that list being able to be amended administratively so the city is able to adapt and change as different species perform well or don't perform so well into the future. And then finally, the challenge is making sure that the enforcement is adequate, especially for new tree plantings, to make sure that the trees are actually thriving, surviving, and providing that future canopy for the long term, and making sure that the enforcement is such that is happening. So with that, I'm through with my presentation, and if you have questions or comments, you can go ahead with that.
I'll jump in. Thank you, Todd. I was the community development director in Lake Oswego for about 8 or 9 years and dealt with a lot of tree issues, and I'm sure you recall some of those. And it brought me to a question, and thank you for all your work on this. I want to put an underline under your number 8, because that's where a lot of the battles come from, the non-development tree removal, either pre-development or post-development. But at any rate, I have a question for you, and I think you might know the answer. One of the things that we relied on in Lake Oswego fairly often was the use of grade beams in foundation design or footing design for homes and other buildings to span tree roots. And I'm wondering if it worked. We did it for years, but I haven't been back there to check in with people and say, okay, did that work? Did that actually save those trees?
I mean, I'm not talking about specific trees, so I'm just going to talk in generalities, but they do work. But this kind of gets back to the discussion of the elevation of the house that we're talking about and those height limits. So in general, you can use a grade beam, which is a foundation system that basically, to simplify it, there's piers kind of towards the corners of the foundation, and then a beam spans at grade over tree roots that may be adjacent to the foundation. That can work as long as, most communities, I don't know if this is state law or local law, require excavation of a crawl space underneath a building So even though that beam might be at grade, then, you know, you have to also consider that, you know, maybe an 18-inch crawl space has to be dug out, and that can get into the tree root. So I've been involved in several scenarios like that, where if there's the flexibility to just, you know, eliminate crawl spaces, that's not always a good idea to do, but make them not as deep, or, you know, raise the elevation of the entire building, so you can kind of really get over the roots with the grade beam plus the crawl space, and that can work really well. It's just in most communities, the house is designed to the maximum height limit, and then raising the elevation of the house is a non-starter because you're violating that height limit. So to the discussion we had earlier, I really like that idea of not necessarily just saying, oh, you get an extra story on your house. That's not really, in this scenario I'm talking about, that wouldn't help. It's really, you know, if you can go up another 3 feet into the height limit, if required to preserve a tree root, then that should be something that's allowed.
Thank you.
I think Micah and then Councillor Beatty.
Yeah, thanks, Todd, for the presentation. Overall, I think it's in a great place. I really appreciate the preference of preserving what we have, the existing canopy, and at the same time adding in density or planting standards for new lots. I also like the discretionary review aspect, which makes it flexible and can help push forward other city priorities. And the pre-screening piece that was in the full code, I think that's a great way to help developers navigate a new code and ensure that we're maximizing the benefits. I guess my last point is I agree with the point that Stefan made that number 8 to me is the most important piece of this, that whatever tree code we come up with for the middle housing project is also applicable to non-development situations. And that's to ensure that there isn't a pre or post development loophole where trees are removed, healthy trees are removed without mitigation or whatnot. And it also, like, if the tree code was not relevant to non-development situations, we would get nowhere near our canopy goals if it was just open season on all healthy trees in non-development situations. So I think it's really important that number 8 is a certainty as part of this regulation, with the caveats that yes, dead, dying, and dangerous trees can be removed without mitigation, and that there are these discretionary review processes to find flexibility.
Yeah, I did want to add on to that. I kind of skipped over the pre-screening idea, and I saw there was a comment in the chat about that. Stefan probably remembers when he was working for a city like Oswego, there was an arborist on staff, and Milwaukee's really blessed to have an arborist on staff as well, or urban forester, and that's really not common in communities of a smaller size like Milwaukee. Most cities don't have an urban forester in communities of a smaller size in the Portland region. So it's really a valuable kind of tool that can be used as part of the pre-application, which is what was done in Lake Oswego when there was an arborist on staff, to identify, okay, what are these priority trees? What are the trees we're really interested in preserving with this specific development? And in my experience, if the developers know that and those are identified, then they work really hard to preserve those trees, because they know it's just going to be easier for everybody if they can accommodate those. So I think kind of that non-regulatory piece is a really important aspect of this that the city could implement going forward.
Great. So Councillor Beatty, and then I also see Jacob, and I think I just saw Renee, but they got to be quick because we have a lot to get through. So if you can make them quick, if they're going to be bigger discussions, maybe we'll wait if we have time at the end. So
I hope this one's easy, and it may have been answered in some of the stuff in the packet I didn't get to, but when you talk about setting a percentage goal for a parcel and of the canopy, and you talk about the existing trees and the planted trees, how do you estimate the planted tree? At what point is it supposed to, how many years, I guess, how do you calculate that?
We haven't gotten into the specifics of it yet, the calculations, but typically, for example, the Tiger Code has a canopy standard, and it is based on the full maturity of the tree. So, you know, trees have different sizes at maturity, and that's what's used. And that's why it's so important to make sure they're set up for success as far as soils and enforcement, so they can grow
and
that.
full maturity for some trees is 10 years, and then for some trees is 100 years, right? Full maturity is a different thing for different kinds of trees.
Yeah, depending on the growth rates, and yeah, they mature at different rates. But if a tree's mature at 10 years, my guess is that that's not the type of tree that the city's going to be interested in, because they're going to be a short-lived